This next panel is a particularly timely topic. Americans are eating more seafood than ever before. We've discovered that it's a heart food, a brain food, a longevity food. It's a superfood in general. And yet we're discovering this at a time when our oceans are overfished, polluted, and over-carbonized, affected by climate change, and also at a time where over 80% of the seafood in this country, and for most wealthy seafood-eating countries, is imported. So even if the local food movement is strongly rooted in food that you can find nearby, the interest in consuming more seafood really hasn't caught up to that. And there's no other author more familiar with this phenomenon than Paul Greenberg, the moderator of this panel. Paul is the author of the James Beard Award-winning New York Times bestseller For Fish, The Future of the Last Wild Food. He's a regular contributor to the New York Times. He's written for National Geographic, GQ, the Times of London, Vogue, and lectures on seafood and environment around the world. He's currently a fellow at the Blue Ocean Institute and also a Pew Fellow on Marine Conservation. His next book, which I'm particularly excited about, is American Catch, a book about how we lost and how we may regain American local seafood. You can get regular updates from Paul at his Twitter handle at 4fishgreenberg and on facebook.com/4fish. Paul.
Thank you. All right, are we going to have the same problem? No. Yes, we are. All right, microphone people, please turn the microphones on. If not, I'll just shout. Fishermen are good at shouting, so it's not a big deal. You know, there seems to be this war on statistics here, thanks to Mark. Thanks, Mark. But I thought my most personal encounter with fishermen and statistics, I was up at the New Fulton Fish Market, which is way up in Nosebleed territory in the Bronx. I was interviewing Herb Slavin from Slavin & Sons. Anybody ever do business with Herb Slavin? I feel sorry for you if you have, because you probably came out on the short end. But I said to Herb, Herb, how do you feel about the fact that like 90% of our seafood that we eat comes from abroad? And he looks at me and he goes, "Who's the broad?" So that's a fisherman's usual answer to statistics. But, you know, it is worth going through some statistics. The thing is, you know, if Mark said that the land food system was bullshit, you should see the seafood system. Not only is 90% of our seafood imported, and actually, you know, Brian said 80. It's a big toss-up because when I talk to National Marine Fisheries Service about that number, they go, "Well, that's kind of a squishy number." I'm like, "Are you the government?" And I'm like, "Well, why is it squishy?" And they're like, "Well, so a certain amount of fish that we send that we catch, we send abroad." I'm like, "Well, how much do we catch and send abroad?" It's like, "Well, about a third of it. We're importing 90% of what we eat, but we send a third of what we catch abroad." Yeah. Okay. And she goes, "And then there's the stuff that comes back to us." The stuff that comes back to us? Yeah, well, so a lot of fish we catch and we freeze it here because we don't have the processing facilities anymore, and we send it to China, and they defrost it, and they take the bones out, and then they refreeze it, and then they send it back to America. How's that for food miles? And speaking of food miles, another statistic, 90% of our seafood coming to us from abroad. A recent paper that Sean was so kind to point out to me noted that the average food miles traveled by imported seafood is over 4,000 miles. Woohoo! Carbon footprint, here we come. Another kind of crazy thing about the foreign seafood that we eat, whereas most of the seafood that we're sending abroad is wild, more than half of what we're importing is farmed. So we're low grading ourselves. We're sending all the good stuff, the high omega stuff, the wild stuff. A lot of our salmon, something like 70% of our wild salmon, we send abroad. And then in return, we get this kind of dubious farmed product, mostly from Asia, less than 2% of which has been inspected. It's really, really crazy. but the most important statistic that I've kind of encountered, and something I think that hopefully my panel will be able to speak to, is that when I was looking at American Catch, I have to make a small plug for it. I'm in the period, a very sarcastic longtime author said to me, I'm in the period we authors call the calm before the calm. So this is the calm before the calm. If you want to make it into a storm, it's up to you. But the real question is, how did we get ourselves into this American Catch? We got into it, I believe, because we destroyed our local fish markets. I was up at the New Fulton Fish Market, which, as I say, used to be down in my neighborhood. The old Fulton Fish Market was a great place. I moved in, it moved out. I don't know why. But it moved all the way up to Nosebleed Territory in the Bronx. There's no foot traffic. It's a very sad place. It's a big industrial box that nobody visits anymore. And I remember talking to one of the fishmongers, and he said to me, used to be the wives, they came, they talked to the fishmonger. The fishmonger said, this fish is good, you should cook this. Well, how do I cook? You cook it like this. And they would cook it like this, and it was good. Now the wives, they go to the supermarket, they go to the fish guy. The fish guy used to work in the deli counter. He knows nothing about fish. He tells her to eat this fish. She eats it, it's terrible, it sucks, and they never eat fish again. And yeah, it's true. I mean, even though we've been eating more fish in this country, we still eat only about 15 pounds of seafood per person per year, whereas we eat more than 100 pounds of red meat per year. So that's kind of screwed up, especially since seafood is so much better for you. Anyway, but the big swap that's occurred, the big change that's happened in seafood markets over these last few years is the loss of the local seafood market. During the time that the American seafood deficit really surged, local fishmongers, fish markets, went from controlling about 80% of the seafood trade to about 20%. And supermarkets did the reverse, went from controlling about 20% to about 80%. So no surprise, we have been completely divorced from our seafood system. So today I have really great people here. We were noticing all of us that have anything to do with the ocean seem to have pretty good tans. Sean was saying that the bottom of his nostrils get tan from the reflection of the water. But we have three people here who are doing really interesting things to try and reverse all the things I'm talking about. Sean Barrett is from Dock to Dish, and he'll tell you a bit about the business. But what's your Twitter handle? Okay, well, yeah, they'll at Dock to Dish. They'll turn your microphone on when you talk. Anyway, doing great work, and he'll tell you all about his restaurant-supported fishery. Brent Smith, who I visited on his Thimble Island oyster company, does much more than oysters. He's, in fact, growing kelp and shellfish, and you might have seen him on his TED Talk, The Least Dangerous Catch. I recommend it very highly. And you're at Thimble Islands? Yeah. And then Mike Martinson from Montauk Shellfish Company. I have probably scarfed more Montauk pearls, the oysters he produced, than Mike weighs. I've eaten several Mike's worth of Montauk pearls. They're briny and delicious and wonderful. But Mike also finds himself trying to basically create a food system in Montauk, which is quickly going from a food system to a vacation system. Ever since Kate Winslet, I think, in that movie, The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, meet me in Montauk. I mean, I think the fishermen were like, fuck. Anyway. But without further ado, I'm going to just let each of these guys have a shot, and we'll hopefully get a conversation going, and we'll have some time for questions. And we're going to go 10 minutes into lunch. Ted Ames, a great fisheries biologist, said to me, when I asked him about, is Alaska pollock going to get overfished, he said, well, in my experience, you never get between a fat hog and its trough. So we're going to try not to do that too much in lunch. But you all look very slim. So anyway, so we'll start with Sean. Sean, tell us about Dock to Dish, and tell us also maybe a little bit about the seafood system that you're trying to correct.
Okay. Thanks for the intro, Paul, and thank you to all the Edible folks for putting this together, I think. And definitely Brian Hallwell has been a great champion of what we're doing here. And what we're doing here is really a pretty, I'd like to take some credit for it, but I really just borrowed some ideas from some of the farmer folks, actually. We saw a very similar kind of thing happening, as Paul was saying, with our local seafood. And this toxic food system that was we were encountering. And why weren't people, why was there no access to our local seafood? We've had a 20-year kind of run, which Paul can speak to later, under great laws that have made sustainability has been put back into our local fish species to a large degree. And so, the statistics, over 90% of seafood in this country being imported, and of that 50% is aquaculture, and of the 40% that's wild sourced, like half of that is pirated or comes from illegal sources. And so then once that seafood's actually here, like about 1 in 3 are the statistics, is mislabeled as something it's not. And none of that speaks to the length of time that it goes from the dock to your dish. So we see, born on labels on a bottle of beer and expiration dates on a stick of butter, but for some reason fresh fish is just kind of like, the honor system. So, I grew up fishing local waters in Shinnecock and Montauk and grew up on same-day source seafood, and to me that's what seafood was, and I had long been on a quest to try to figure out a way to make that accessible to a larger community base. And I think, I found myself a couple of years ago with about 10,000 hours of fishing experience and about 10,000 hours of restaurant experience, and I started on a track of like, how can I put these together and actually do something to maybe help. I saw some resources, and I had a lot of friends in commercial fishing, I had a lot of friends in the restaurant industry, and thought there's a simple marriage that's waiting to be happen here. Like all the restaurant guys, in the farm-to-table movement, or the food movement, I got a little lost in that chronology, the language earlier, but I heard a lot of guys, restaurant guys, saying we need fresh fish, we just can't get it. And a lot of the commercial fishermen guys are saying we have tons of fresh fish, it's just getting shipped overseas. So I came across, I started on this quest, and it was really the tale of two hills, basically. Quail Hill Organic Farm out in Amagansett, and a farmer named Scott Chasky. You guys know Scott is a great, another fellow who we wouldn't be here without. And so he put out a book, This Common Ground, and I came across that. It was all about organic farming and CSAs. Scott founded the oldest organic CSA in New York, and so that was really the spark, which, I thought to myself, could we do a CSF? Could we do a community-supported fishery that behaves just like Scott's community-supported agriculture? So behind that, I should say, I'd been watching this guy, Dan Barber, for quite some time, and that was the other hill. So it was Quail Hill and Blue Hill, Stone Barns. And so my two kind of sources of inspiration, I really borrowed my philosophies from Dan and then the actual tools from Scott. And we put together Dock to Dish, which is really, in a simple, Dock to Dish, very fresh fish. It essentially is a community-supported fishery for, we have 5 pickup locations for our local community members in Montauk, Amagansett, Sag Harbor, and now in Mattatuck on the North Fork. Scott has recently, we pick up your fish at Quail Hill, which is something I think that probably hasn't happened in quite some time. But same-day source sustainable seafood with local organic veggies. So then Dan said to me last summer, we got to kick this up. Dude, can you do this for some of my friends? So I was like, okay, I think, because we were tinkering around with a restaurant-supported fishery, basically a big brother of a community-supported fishery. And so he called me in his office one day, and Dan is a brilliant dude, and when he has these big thoughts, sometimes I have to fasten my seatbelt. Because I'm like, oh, okay, that's huge. And this was huge. And he said, I'm going to, he evaluated if we could handle it, but he said, I'm going to lay this out for you. And he spent the rest of that afternoon. He called April Bloomfield, Eric Repair, Bill Telepan, some great people he knew that understood. And we successfully, from there, launched the first restaurant-supported fishery in North America. So what we've done is taken about 36, we have 2 guys on suspension right now, our fishermen, but we got 36 commercial fishermen on our supply side, on the dock side of our equation, and we've got 10 restaurants on the dish side. And, through, like Brennan and I were talking about, just kind of what we do, kind of the simple formula, the mathematical formula of dock to dish, through this CSA model that we borrowed from Scott, and with the support of Dan Barber, we've suddenly got, we're starting to move some seafood to these guys. And what we do is we source, like this past week, I source on Tuesday, I work on the docks with a whole bunch of different guys. We have pound trap fishermen, we've got pin hookers, we've got spear gun fishermen, and we essentially take their haul, break it into shares like you would a CSA, and deliver within 24 hours. That fish is in Blue Hill, Le Bernardin, Telepan, and these guys are serving same-day sourced seafood. So we're Dr. Dish, very fresh fish.
We were talking beforehand about how you had just given Dan a load of sea robins, which we're calling them American Grenard.
Atlantic Grenard.
Atlantic Grenard, yes. It's all in the branding, you know.
Right.
We all know that Chilean sea bass was Patagonian toothfish at one point. So, but one thing that was very interesting in this paper that on CSFs that Sean gave me was that CSFs turn out, and while Sean's is the first restaurant-supported fishery, there are a lot of community-supported fisheries starting to come into being all up and down our coasts. It's still a small portion of what actually gets sold. But one thing that came up in that article was, or that report, was that it seems like a CSF model is much better at using underutilized species and bycatch than these big industrial things. Do you find that to be the case?
Certainly the case. I think and it's interesting to hear Paul's perspective on a lot of the things, because I see that on the docks, daily, and it's the underutilized species situation is another one that just strikes you as totally crazy, because we've got like thousands of metric tons of great local seafood that because there's no demand. There's no American demand for it, so
I think it's over 1 billion pounds of bycatch in this country that mostly just goes in the garbage or goes overboard dead.
So in Dan's book, The Third Plate, he talks about we practice ecosystem-based management is our approach to sustainability, and so that, like Dan talks about cooking with the whole farm, it's like we try to encourage, and he says bring it. He's one of the chefs. A lot of chefs are like, yeah, we want salmon, we want tuna, get us shrimp. And I'm like, oh man. And Dan is like, no, bring me what's the discards.
Bring me that Atlantic Grenard.
The sea robins,
bring me the head of the Atlantic Grenard.
So, but he understands that it's about to relieve pressure on the target species, to take pressures off of the species that the popular demand is for, because he can work. The chefs are able to work like magic with a lot of the, make these really delicious dishes out of great local fish, and that we wouldn't otherwise, fishermen do. Atlantic Grenard, sea robin is our secret ingredient to our fish chowder. It holds up great. It's a delicious fish, but it's an ugly looking thing, and it's curious looking. So, but guys, Dan understands. He can take that and make it delicious. It's super hyper abundant, Mike. It's everywhere you look. In every trap and every line, we're catching those everywhere. Like spiny dogfish, there's a few others that are super abundant, and guys like Dan are now leading the charge to get these introduced to American menus. And it's like, it's everywhere out there. It's about connecting, I think, the dock and the dish. So
I think the line is the trash is out there.
Right. You get in trouble though. Trash fish was historically the term for, but I think the next generation or the third plate kind of thinking folks will say there's no such thing as a trash fish.
That's
it's
right.
Underutilized species is what, underloved.
That's
what
right.
we're going for.
As good as the sewage is out there.
That's right. That's right. All right, so let's go over to Bren. Bren, I visited at his Symbol Island oyster company. Oyster Company, I think, that title has sort of outlived its truth because you're really diversified, and I have really watched Bren's operation grow. I think, don't you have something going on with the White House? If they can ever figure out their scheduling, or if they stop shutting down the government, that kind of thing. Yeah. So, Bren, tell us a little about what you've been doing.
Sure. So
and maybe lean into the microphones.
Oh, yeah. So I think maybe I'm your worst nightmare. Can you hear me?
Mike.
Microphone.
Hello.
Mic check.
Hello.
Yeah, do that one.
Hello. So I think I am don't know how to work this, your worst nightmare, right? So, because I literally have the film of a fish with sandwich still on my mouth from McDonald's from last night. I pillaged the oceans for McDonald's. Most of the cod I was catching up in the Bering Sea was for McDonald's. And then I brought a water bottle. I was walking in the house this morning, my girlfriend said, careful, those foodies get violent. And then Mark starts talking about an armed revolution. I'm like, there's no freaking way I'm showing up. Anyway, so, I mean, what I want to talk about a little bit is my model, but it comes out of how to do an artisanal small fishery in the era of climate change. That's really what I've faced. Been a commercial fisherman my whole life, dropped out of school when I was 14. Ended up, after a whole search for sustainability, growing oysters in Long Island Sound. And that was great. It was kind of a quiet life. I missed the high seas, but sort of learned to adjust. Read a lot of Buddhism, which I didn't understand. And, but that was the new life of an arugula farmer on the sea. And so but then the storms hit. So Hurricane Irene, Hurricane Sandy came in, wiped out 80% of my crop, most of my gear lost at sea. And there was no way for me oysters were going to survive, at least in my location, over the next 30 years because of acidification, rising water temps, spreading disease. We're shut down all the time, and the storm surges from the hurricanes. So I had to figure out how to adapt. But adaptation for me, it meant both making a living, but also how do I structure my life and my work around addressing the three big things I faced in my life. One is overfishing, because I'm from Newfoundland and the cod stocks crashed. Two is climate change, and three is really the loss of jobs. You know, thousands of boats beached, fishermen out of work, and that's 90% unemployment in my community. So I started struggling with that. It came out of failure, and came up with this thing called 3D restorative ocean farming, and it wasn't me. I really just looked around and took other pieces and brought it together and simplified it. And really what it is imagine an underwater garden. On top I've got these floating ropes where I grow seaweed and shellfish, which is scallops and mussels, and then below that cages with oysters and clams. And I also harvest salt. So it's how much can we grow in 20 acres, right? My farm has been shrinking from 100 acres down to 20 acres as I've done this. And so it's a sea basket approach, getting away from monoculture, extremely small footprint, which is and grow an incredible amount of food. In a 300 by 300 foot area, I can grow 26 tons of kelp alone in 5 months. Really high volume, very easy to grow. And a low aesthetic impact, which is important, right? Our oceans are beautiful, wild places. I'm underwater. That's a good thing. But as far as these other challenges that I faced in my life, the farm does its own little part. First, everything I grow and all the oysters we grow require zero inputs, no fresh water, no fertilizer, no arid land, no animal feed. These are all things that are going to become increasingly problematic in the era of climate change. I argue this sort of restorative zero input food is the most sustainable food on the planet at this point. It's nutritious, the mussels lean protein, we got omega-3s. And the seaweeds are interesting. They're just packed full of all these great nutrients. And the whole idea is to not eat as many fish, but begin eating what fish eat, right? And we do. I know the land-based movement is on top of this. And we really need to begin, at least in the ocean dinner plate, carving out a section of the plate for some sort of ocean vegetarianism so we can reduce pressures on fish stocks.
Do you consider a shellfish a vegetable?
Yeah, so, well, we know that what the vegans think an oyster is vegan. Or there's one vegan out there, and I cite that one vegan all the time. I think he was drunk, but I don't care. I got him on record.
To me, I think, I don't know. I make a strong argument for bivalve as vegetable. It's very close. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of thinking that goes on.
Yeah, exactly. Although my oysters have taught me a lot.
Yeah, well.
That was an awesome segue.
That's ESP.
Because, I mean, and I really mean that, because this whole idea of restorative farming, oysters sort of taught me that Mother Nature came up with these incredible technologies hundreds of millions of years ago designed to mitigate our harm, right? So oysters soak up all this nitrogen, address dead zones. Kelp soak up 5 times the amount of carbon as land-based plants. I'm turning from a fisherman into some sort of climate farmer. The farm itself serves as an artificial reef system, on and on and on. So my job isn't to save the seas, but really figure out how to be a steward of the seas saving us, right? And the GMO discussion is actually interesting. I agree with everything Mark says, but I'm really coming at it from a different point of view of looking at what nature can do. The last benefit I'd say, and this one's really important to me as a lifelong fisherman, And that's how do we build a foundation for a blue-green economy, right? And in our own little way, we've designed the farms to be replicable, open source. Anybody with 20 acres and a boat, $50,000 can start their own farm, be up and running in the first year. We've got a school-to-jobs program at the Bridgeport Sound School where inner-city kids process all our food, learn about sustainability, and do insane things. One of the kids took our kelp and invented a 12-powered biodegradable kelp battery, right? It's going to be a scary new world.
And it's delicious.
And it's, exactly. And we can spur all these new industries. We've got a program with Yale turning kelp into fertilizer. They use it on their farm, and then the nitrogen leaches back, and we capture it. You know, this idea of creating some closed nutrient loops. So the idea is if we can replicate, we can create a web of these farms, and then around that, entire new industries. In some ways, the artisanal fishery and small-scale fishery is too small bore. We're thinking too small. I used to make $30,000 a summer on the boats in Alaska. Like, I was a steel worker of the sea. And now none of us are actually making money, right? You go deeper into our bank accounts, and there are former hedge fund folks. Your husband's a lawyer, and you're an oyster woman. You're a former cop, so you have a pension and health care. Others of us have multiple jobs, multiple income streams. So we need to figure out how to build up something that's small, replicable, but powerful, and really reimagines our ocean economy. That's it.
Excellent. Great. You can't really have more than that. And then Mike Martinson from Montauk Shellfish Company and his delicious Montauk Pearls. I had wanted Mike to come out specifically because of, I love the oysters, but I also, love Montauk. I remember Montauk as a child fishing in Montauk as a fishing town. I remember Salazar's, which sadly closed, the place with the big white shark on the wall, and you could get a greasy egg sandwich that always tasted faintly of clam bait. But that Montauk we're losing that Montauk very quickly, and Mike, in the middle of it, is doing this really great shellfish farm. So I'm just curious how that's going, and how do you maintain a food system in that context?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be at your side as well as with you, Sean, and Brad. Nice to make your personal acquaintance. Yeah. Your TED Talk was phenomenal. Salavar's is reopened.
Oh.
Robbie Devlin's doing a really good job there. He brought his, the Chowder House, which was on Westlake, is now moved over to Salavar's.
Oh, terrific.
Really done with a
Did I say
nice,
Salazar's?
nice
Sorry,
taste.
Salavar's, yes.
Done in nice taste, and I mean that on many levels.
Oh, terrific. So is the white shark back?
It's there.
Oh, excellent. All right.
And it's big. So Montauk Shellfish Company was the brainchild of my partner, my original partner and I, Mike Dole, who's a professor at Stony Brook University. He and I, we met at Stony Brook University. I was a commercial fisherman for 20 years already before I went back to school to get a degree. Completely frustrated with my abilities to make a living as a commercial fisherman. Literally, when I was 11 years old, I started putting money into my family's home and food on the table, digging clams with my feet down the beach, selling them to the neighbors for $1 a dozen. And those were good times, actually. It was a good childhood growing up near the water. I was very fortunate. I had my first boat at 11 years old, and I worked my way up from a 16-foot Sharpie through to actually being able to run a 108-foot offshore dragger. A lot of the experiences that I had as a commercial fisherman, one, in high school, I made my best money. High school, 11th grade, $1,500 in a day. I was very dedicated to wanting to start my family young. My goal was really to have my house and have my kids by the time I was 25. And I was so set on that it was just work, and work was fun. And find your love. Okay, found my love, started my family, built my house. I was 25, I did it. But I wasn't really thinking about the sustainability of, one, who I chose to fall in love with, and two, and two, the estuary I had been so fortunate to be able to take advantage of. And You know, Long Island is it's a somewhat limited space, especially with millions and millions of people living on it. We have a population density problem and major issues that I didn't realize were going to be undermining my plans. So I built my house on oysters. 1995, excellent year for oysters in Long Island Sound. Banner year. 96, still going pretty strong, very strong actually. I had an Asian guy that I was selling some smaller oysters to, and MSX and Dermo hit Long Island Sound on such a strong level, it wiped out literally every single oyster in New York. We went from having boatloads. I could fill my boat by 10 in the morning, go back out and do it again if I wanted to, you know, tempt fate and the law. But I could fill my boat. And it went from major catches to zero. And I mean zero. I couldn't make 20 bucks in a day. And I had a wife who was now pregnant and a house to pay for. And I was like, what am I going to do? Major collapse. Fortunately, this Asian guy who was a little shady, he said, look, can you get me some lobsters? I need lobsters for this account. He gave me $10,000 in cash. I went down to the dock and saw some of my buddies that I had fished with and said, look, I need lobsters. So I filled my truck up with lobsters, brought them back to him. I made $0.25 a pound. Started what became a huge lobster success. For 3 years, I was buying and selling lobsters from fishermen I grew up with. I had 16 guys selling me product. I built refrigerated saltwater tanks and had a tractor trailer and refrigerated trucks, 16 people working, 16 fishing boats working for me. And again, 1999, major collapse. I went from, you know, $350,000 a year to zero in 1999. And I was like, man, here we go again. So now I'm clamming on Raritan Bay, living in Northport, and I see QPX hitting the clams, and the clams are dying. And meanwhile, there's another fishery that had been strong forever. So now there's 3 major fisheries collapses that I've endured. And I just shake my head, ended up with a divorce, and went back to school to get a degree in biology and hopefully figure out what I'm going to do. And what I did was I finished my degree, ran out of money, and went back to work on a commercial fishing boat. Ended up offshore out of Montauk, living in Montauk, because Montauk is a really beautiful piece of heaven. It's absolutely a beautiful piece of earth. I've done some traveling, and I've never found something so beautiful as Montauk.
But don't move there, please.
There's enough people visiting. I know. Shh, the cat's out of the bag. So now, during my education, I had been approached to do some undergraduate research with PhD Dr. Diana Padilla and Michael Dole at Stony Brook University. And I was a very responsible student, and I did a lot of research on hard clam reproductive success in the Great South Bay. And I volunteered and donated my boat and time to planting 1 million clams on Great South Bay with the Nature Conservancy and monitoring the clams to see when they spawn and try to figure out why the spawns are not successful down there. That's a story for another day. But years went by. I was working offshore on the Jason and Danielle, catching fish for a living, hands tied behind our backs by the regulators who keep forcing us to kill more fish and land less. The bycatch that we spoke of earlier, the only way to change that bycatch is to change the law and make the boats have to keep what they catch. If the boats are allowed to target a species and discard other species in the process, you're never going to get over that, and it's not sustainable. That's one of the most important points that I have from my career. But I had a very interesting experience on that boat on Earth Day 2010. The Montauk Shellfish Company had been spawned, with my professor having reached back out to me saying, hey, I want to start an oyster farm, and our farm began. in Montauk. Originally it was going to be Connecticut. But Earth Day 2010, does that date ring a bell to anybody here? Because I want to point out that the Gulf oil spill disaster occurred on that day. All right? That was a major day in my life. I thought the oceans were dying for good. I thought the whole system was going to collapse. I thought we were done for. I was fishing offshore. We were at Hydrographer's Canyon. We were targeting squid. Had an accidental bycatch, creature I really loved. And I was a sentimental fisherman. I'd jump into the pile of fish and start throwing over whatever we weren't going to be allowed to keep and whatever was still kicking a little bit and try to give it a shot to swim away, and usually had some success. But these guys, they were really big, and there was more important things, and they weren't going to be saved. And it was very sad. And we cleared the deck, and I found myself shrouded in fog, alone on the stern of the boat, looking into a glimmer of light on the ocean's surface. A girl that I had been very close to, Buddhist by chance, had taught me a chant, and it was a way for me to pray. And she taught me to chant into the light. And so I chanted this chant. It was Nam Myo Ho Renge Kyo. And I just repeated that chant over and over into the light, and actually fell into a little bit of a trance. The haulback engines kicked in, which is a big engine. It kind of startled me out of my moment. I looked to my left, and up in the rigging, there's a northern flicker in the sunlight. My buddy up by the wheelhouse is yelling at me to get a sandwich because it was our last chance at a break for a long time. And I asked him for a bowl of water for the bird. I walked up to the wheelhouse, put the bowl of water out for the bird, went into the tool room and ate my sandwich. When I came back out, the fog had lifted. There were 10 to 20,000 pilot whales surrounding the boat. I mean, as dense as you guys are in this theater, that's how thick they were, as far as you could see. And the fog had lifted, so I could see a good 3/4 of a mile. And there were rainbows in the mist of the blowholes, for dozens of rainbows off the stern of the boat coming in their air. And my hair stood up, and I was like, whoa, they had responded to my prayer. And what I was praying was, let me be your voice. And I was apologizing for humanity and the impact that we have on the innocent wild creatures. Now, I'll skip the rest, even though it does get better. The oyster farm has really turned into something phenomenal. It's something that I've really kind of fallen into. It's just, I like to call it a perpetual circle of goodness, because the oysters were gone. They're not anymore. Uptide and downtide of our farm, we've had successful reproduction, and there are wild oysters now on every piling and every rock in Lake Montauk. Also, the oysters are natural filter feeders. Without them, the marine environment has a dwindled chance of being able to keep up with what it needs to as far as filtering out nitrogen, and especially with the increased nitrogen that so many humans in such a tight space are adding to the water. So it's a perpetual circle of goodness. There's also the gear creates habitat for the juvenile fish. I can't find anything wrong with what I'm doing. Nothing. It's really, I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, I would just to. I mean, that amazing story. But, it's interesting to see how much shit the oyster farmers are facing. I just was going to read a little passage. Another oyster farmer, Bob Rowe, who I think you guys know, right? Skid Row, he identifies himself, so you know how to pronounce his name. But he had a similar experience. He said of his oyster farm he started in Rhode Island, we took a patch of 2.3 acres of black eutrophic anoxic bottom, unproductive and virtually barren, and after a few years it was transformed into one of the most vibrant dive spots in Rhode Island. We sent a few scientists to document the diversity and abundances of species. We found that our pissant little 2.3 acre farm was now home to thousands of baby lobsters, thousands of juvenile sea bass, and other fish. We set up traps for scup around the perimeter because fishing on the lease was so good. We slammed them. So it's just, a really win-win situation. But then you have the story, like in the Boston Globe, I don't know if you saw this, but the Kraft family that owns the Patriots just managed to slip into some Massachusetts legislation the banning of an oyster farm off Mashpee because it's in their view shed. they don't want to look at the oyster farm. So, I mean, is that something you come up against as well?
We, as an oyster farmer, we are very limited. We're limited in our ability to grow because, well, as a commercial fisherman, I can go set my gear anywhere. I mean, there's a couple of sanctuaries I can't go near. But as an oyster farmer, I can't just go and set cages of oysters out there someplace. I have to go through the Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. DEC, I mean the New York State DEC. There's 4 different agencies to get permits for, but first I have to get a lease and permission to use bottom someplace. New York State will only give us 5 acres temporarily, and there's really very limited access to farmers that want to do good in this industry. In Montauk, it's a little bit different because all of Montauk was once privately owned, and Lake Montauk had been subdivided, and the homeowners along the tidelands were paying property taxes on underwater lands for years and years and years. And it turns out they have the rights now. They own underneath the water. They own the bottomlands. So our start was through a private agreement with a private landowner to lease his bottomlands, and that was how we started. Now, there are neighbors, and especially now, more and more of them are very well-to-do, and they don't want to really see a big barge out there or some, maybe they don't want their wives seeing 6 sexy guys working in the sun. I don't know. But.
Oh, my God, you finally identified it. I didn't know.
Hey, Paul, just one thing on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's the aesthetic problem of rich folks, and then
I know the jewelry they wear.
Yeah.
It's just terrible.
Exactly. and then there's another piece of this, which is the conservation movement, which I argue actually are no longer environmentalists, right? They're Teddy Roosevelt environmentalists. We could set aside the entire ocean and it's still going to die, right? Because of acidification, because of climate change, because of rising population, food security, these issues. And until the environmentalists deal with the greatest environmental problems of our time, they're not coming with a solution. So I say to them, if you have a better way to fix this than oyster farming, than 3D restorative farming, then put it on the table and we'll try it, but your strategy is not going to work.
Interesting.
So,
Here.
pretty cool. I don't know if I told you this, Mike, but we deal almost exclusively with wild finfish. But at the end of last season, it was a cold season, and we were, and Mike and I made an arrangement to use. I told Barber about his Montauk pearls, and so we did a whole week of our restaurant sport fishery. April, Eric Repair, everybody got Mike's oysters, which are awesome. And so to full circle that, Dan assigns me with a soil scientist at the Stone Barns Center for Agriculture, and this guy Jack Algier is another great farmer from up there. And what they did was they took the leftover shells, the shells from your oysters after Blue Hill was done with them, and they grind them up to put them as compost with their organic farm, I guess the calcium or something to do with. So that full circle you were talking about, I think, is, it's being carried on through our program, which is like, it's very cool to see.
Yeah, it's awesome.
But the elephant in the room, though, I think to some degree is, well, it's the tall guy. It's wild fisheries, because, we love oysters, we love kelp, but at the end of the day, what people seem to want when they think of seafood, they think of fish. I keep wondering, where is that transformative fisherman, that yeoman fisherman that has this new aesthetics? I mean, I fish in Montauk quite a bit. I was on a 5-day offshore trip for tilefish and tuna. And we came into Montauk, and I had that Montauk moment. Wow, what a beautiful, heart of the sea, beautiful, great place. And I'm on the Viking. We pull up to the dock, and the mates throw the ropes over, and there's somebody has written on the side of the dock, and I quote, "Put the fucking ropes back the right way, shitheads." And it was just to be like...
That's poetry. That's poetry.
Poetry. Put the fucking ropes back. And so the question is like, where are those, is there a transformative fisherman out there? I certainly know there are a lot of transformative oyster farmers out there, but, fishing seems like it's a lot of older guys doing it. It's hard to get young people into fishing. Is there a solution for a better kind of fisherman to come out there?
Okay, so great question there, I think, and that's correct. Like farmers, I think we see a lot of our fishermen in the harbor guys are in their 40s, 50s, 60s. There's not a lot of young bucks coming into the industry, and so certainly regulation is hard. It's very difficult to get licenses, but I think it speaks to the overall system, Paul. I think, and I mean, I can only really say from dock to dish what we're doing. What we've created by eliminating that whole chain of custody formerly, because you see our guys get paid dirt. It's really this, seafood leaves Montauk, it enters this chain of custody where every step of the way in that chain, it's lowering quality and raising price. So the end result, typically for the consumer, is a very high price, low quality item. The fishermen see their price at the dock as like, you know, like Mike was saying, or Bren was saying, it's very hard to make a living as a fisherman. And so what Dr. Dish has done, kind of put the horse back before the cart, I think, is the highest dollar at the dock these guys have seen in a lot of years. By eliminating that whole chain of custody, we're able to give our guys great, you know, the best rates they've seen price per pound for their fish, for their haul in a long time. So that's giving this whole kind of peripheral benefits expansion coming out on that, from incentivizing them to not overfish. You know, a lot of the guys will say if you're dealing with Dr. Dish, you're playing by all the rules, everything's above board, but the price that we're able to pay our guys directly by eliminating that whole chain of custody is kind of restoring enthusiasm and interest. A lot of our guys have been sitting on their licenses. Wade and a couple of their guys, it just hasn't been worth it for them. Black sea bass, 50-pound limit a day. I think fluke, you know, the limits are so restrictive that unless the price per pound is elevated that the fishermen get, it's not worth it. You spend more on ice and gas and bait than to go out and fish for the day. So through a restaurant or a community supported fishery where we're able to give a much higher, the highest dollar at the dock to the fishermen, we're starting to see a lot of guys come out of, reactivate their license and fishing again, and getting excited about it, which is cool to see.
Anybody else want to comment?
I'll just say that, I don't know, I'm always blaming environmentalists. I was there at the seal hunt in Newfoundland, and we used to say men are as cute as seals. So, the way that the cod crash was handled by the government and by environmentalists took an entire generation in industry and turned them, and just created the jobs versus environment split that we're still living out. And that just keeps on replaying, and there's a younger generation of us that are trying to get around that and trying to negotiate that difference. But my guys in Gloucester, for example, we call them like bohemian working class guys who come out of the 60s, they're all working class, very environmental, very progressive left in many ways, and they all hate the government. Just because they got, it was brutal. I mean, it takes decades, generations to build up an economy, but it seems like when you wipe it out, it happens overnight. And it's a shock. And so we're looking for the Captains Gordons of sustainability, but we're still living through that political nightmare.
Okay, I think we have a few minutes for, Brian said we'll go a little 10 minutes long since we started late. We could take a few questions if people want to come up to the mics. Sure.
Gee, I got the advantage because I'm
Yes,
sitting right there.
here.
Francesca Rhiannon from Sustainable East End. My co-producer interviewed you recently. It's a radio show out on the East End of Long Island. I also work for CSR Wire, which is corporate social responsibility. So these are really important issues. What I'd like to ask, I think you've really zeroed in on the climate change issue. And then you're also talking about environmentalists. And there are plenty of environmentalists who are working on climate change. I mean, I don't think that's not happening right now. And I hate to see that kind of conflict that you're talking about. My question is how do you, in a time of climate change, for example, with oysters where the oceans are acidifying, in a time of overfishing, how could it have been different? For example, you got to put fishing limits on. How do you do a sustainable policy around seafood that's a broad policy in a time of so many impacts that are being felt?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I've got a really simple answer, which is addressing climate change is going to create a crap load of jobs. So whether you're replicating small restorative farms or you're reimagining a fisherman and oyster farmer as an oyster texture, oyster park maintenance guy, or you embed 3D farms on wind farms. You just unpack this, addressing acidification, carbon emissions, all these things, and trying to restore our seas while producing food. It's labor intensive. So, and the funny thing, I have been absolutely hopeless up until this point in my life. I am so excited now because we're so screwed that we have to innovate.
Everybody's become a fisherman now,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, exactly. And so, so I don't know, maybe I'm just a little drunk and high, but that's what is exciting about it, is that we're kind of screwed and we're going to innovate, and I think we're seeing innovations around. I'm just one little piece of the puzzle, but I got a lot of hope for thousands or millions other ones.
I'd like to add to that.
Yeah.
So, climate change. What's causing it? Right? I mean, you can doctor it up any way you want. You can go around and add things to the water to try to correct the pH, maybe? No, you're not going to do that. I mean, the problem is that we have all grown accustomed and we take for granted luxuries. And look at what is the cause of climate change and why are the oceans becoming more acidic? Is it your car? That's how I got here. Sustainability, when you have billions of people on a planet, is that's a very, very, almost ridiculous question. But each and every one in this room, I'm sure, is wide open to being, and probably is acting in a very sustainable way relative to the rest of the population. So one by one, we'll just keep putting the next best foot forward.
And I would say that an exciting thing happening here in New York, just recently, the New York Harbor School announced the launch of their Billion Oyster Project here in New York City. The goal is to put 1 billion oysters into New York City waters by, I think, 2025 is the goal. And there's quite a few oysters they've already put in, and it's actually extremely exciting. But I would say, add to that, you have to get that 1% that more and more owns the waterfront to understand the importance of oyster farms and reimagining this kind of things. You have the example of the craft people who sneakily put in legislation into the Massachusetts budget bill to keep an oyster farm out of their view shed. But then you have people like an heiress to the DuPont fortune on Fisher's Island, who really has made friends with local oysters, and she's famously quoted to have said, "I think it adds distinction to my property." So, we're the 1% to embrace that motto. I think we would be in a much better shape. So, next question.
Hi, my name is Claire Cummings, and I'm the waste specialist for Bon Appetit Management Company. And Bon Appetit's a food service provider around the country, and my job is to figure out how we can play a role in reducing waste. And I heard, Mike, you mentioned the need for reform of bycatch policy. Currently, I work with farmers on trying to capture produce that would otherwise go to waste. And I'm wondering if there's anything that consumers, especially large institutional food service providers, can do to purchase that bycatch or help prevent it from going to waste. I'd love to hear all four of you elaborate on what policies need to change and if there's anything we as consumers and purchasers can do in the meantime to help.
I'll take this one to start. The major issue with the commercial fishing bycatch and the whole setup lies in that, well, one, as a commercial fisherman, I was always an environmentalist. But now, and as in my adult later years, I realized that the commercial fishermen brethren of mine, for the most part, were not. And the reason why they were not, I put a lot of thought into, and it's fear-based. And that fear originates from legislature taking fisheries away, taking away sources of income in order to, quote unquote, protect the ocean. But what I have to call them this, what the pencil pushers really did, what they really do is with every stroke of the pencil, they force a fisherman to kill more fish and land less. And when I say that, I mean that back in the 70s and 80s, these guys could go out and fish within 5 miles of the beach and make a really good living. The fish that they were targeting, yep, they became overfished. We had Russian trawlers working 12 miles offshore. We have a situation where the more sought after fish are protected and the less sought after fish are free and open. So the fishermen are forced to fish with smaller mesh and go target these smaller species, and in the process they're hitting the young of the larger fish that they're trying to protect. That's the bycatch, that's the problem. Absolutely, there could be use for fertilizer, huge use for fertilizer, from seaweed and to the bycatch from these boats. In the meantime, yes. My goal, and especially now that and in particular because of what Bren's doing, and something I learned about before Bren, but my goal is to go to one of the commercial draggers that I worked on and buy it. And go to the federal government and give them the permit back. And say, now you don't have to worry about me anymore, and you don't have to regulate me anymore. In exchange, I just want 200 acres of bottomlands, and I'll pick the spot, and allow me to use my crew to allow the ecosystem to flourish on its own. And then I'll go into sea scallops and kelp and other things, and I'll prove to the other fishermen that they could make more money and not have to kill fish. They can actually add to the ecosystem and help the ecosystem in the process of feeding the people and their families.
I don't think on that very eloquent note we have to wrap up. Sorry, we have a lot of other questions, but please tweet at everybody here. Again, I'm at number 4 Fish Greenberg, so 4 Fish Greenberg, at Duck to Dish, at Thimble Oysters, and are you on Twitter?
At Montauk Oyster.
At Montauk Oysters. And I guess, to summarize the whole thing, what I would say, I've been desperate to try and come up with a Michael Pollan-esque three-phrase thing, so I'm going to give it a shot here. Eat American seafood, a very broad variety of it, mostly filter feeders. All right, so thank you very much.
Good job, man.
And read edible.